Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we're looking at the Vienna Gambit, the opening you can see on the screen. Probably the most principled way to play the Vienna game by playing f4. So we're going to be looking at e4, e5. White plays knight c3. Now if you haven't seen my introductory video to the Vienna, watch that. You can find the link in the description. You're going to get a basic idea of white's alternatives and black's alternatives. But the main move for black is knight f6. And now white has a couple of options, but the main move is f4, the Vienna Gambit. And this is a very tricky opening in which both sides can go badly wrong very early on, which is why I'm going to do something I never did in a theoretical video. I'm going to start by showing you some traps. And I'm going to show you just how easily one side can lose to some tricks. Now, before we get into that, I should just mention that the main move here for black is d5, and we're going to be looking at fe5, knight e4, and we're going to be focusing on either queen f3 or knight f3. Those are the two main moves. So you can see the main lines in parts 2 and 3 of this video. But before we get into those, let's look at some traps. I want you to get a basic idea of just how dangerous the Vienna Gambit is. So, after e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, white goes f4, black goes for d5, the main lines, fe5, knight e4, and we're going to be looking at knight f3 in this trap. Well, what if black goes bishop g4? Bishop g4 is not a bad move. It has been played a couple of times. White goes queen e2, threatening to take the knight on e4. And now if knight c6, attacking the pawn on e5 and threatening knight d4, we can take that knight. And if knight takes d4 and black is thinking, okay, I'm getting more than a pawn, white isn't winning a pawn, well, we are simply winning after queen to d3, attacking both pieces. And now if bishop takes, we go knight g3, and black is about to lose a piece. Both pieces are hanging. I should mention that after knight takes e4, black is still okay after d takes e4, but white is better. So after queen e2, black's best move is just knight c3. So this is the first trap, and it seems very reasonable to go knight d4. However, after this, you're a piece down. So that's the type of trap, and this is advanced. I'm going to show you some simpler traps too, where you can hang your queen or mate, but I wanted to start with the more advanced stuff. Okay, moving on. In the next trap, again, e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, the Vienna Gambit, and d5. Again, we are in the main line, so these traps I'm trying to show you happen when people do know something. It's not like they blunder their queen or move 5. So fe5, knight e4, and in this case we're going to go queen f3 and knight c6. And now black is looking to play the move knight d4 once again. And in this position, after knight c6, white's only move is bishop b5, white's only good move, pinning that knight, preventing knight d4. If white tries to win a pawn, white is busted. Knight takes, and then knight d4. And now if you're thinking, well, I have to defend c2, and you know my queen is hanging, so there are basically two moves. You can play queen c3 or queen d3. Queen c3 is safer. After queen c3, white isn't completely losing. If you turn on the engine, after d4, black is only -1, but it's still overwhelmingly better for black. If queen d3, this is game over. D takes e4. Of course, if queen e4, then bishop f5 and knight c2 is coming. And after d4, if queen c3, then there's the move bishop b4. And now again, if you move the queen away, there's knight c2. If you take the bishop, there's knight c2, and white is losing. So these kinds of things can happen very often, very early in the game. So watch out for this pattern of knight d4. The next trap, again, let's go into the mainline theory. So e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, the Vienna Gambit, d5, everything standard so far, fe5, knight e4. Again, we're going to be looking at a position with knight f3. Or what if black plays bishop c5? Trying to play either knight f2 or bishop e2 or bishop f2. Well, in this case, there's the move d4, which is, I think, better than the alternative I'm about to show you, queen e2. But the alternative is still a theoretical line, and it goes bishop f2 check, king d1, and so on. I'm going to be showing you that when we look at knight f3 theory. But what if black plays knight f2? Well, after knight f2, black is losing. We go d4, and this knight can take on h1, but it's going to be trapped. And black loses 2 pieces for a rook, and the game is over. For example, bishop g4, bishop f4, let's say castles, castles, and eventually we're going to move these 2 pieces, and we're going to take the knight. The knight is never getting out. So that's another type of trap you have to watch out for. Now moving on, let's say e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4, d5, fe5, knight e4, again a line with queen f3. Black takes on c3, which is the main move, and bc3 is less common than dc3, but it's still playable. And now c5. And in this position, white has a couple of options. Bishop b5 is the best option. You may be tempted to play a very standard, very thematic move, and a move that's often the main move in many positions, and that's d4. In this case, it loses immediately. And it's funny how a move like d4 can lose. Well, you're not covering the h4 square, so you're hanging queen h4 check and this pawn. So if pawn takes, you cannot take back, and you're down a pawn. If pawn takes, then queen h4 check. And if g3, then queen takes d4, of course, and black is completely winning. 2 things are hanging. Slightly better is queen f2, but not much better, just bishop b4 check. And again, you're going to lose. You have to keep the king on e2, otherwise you lose the queen. So after king e2, queen f2 check, king f2, and bishop c3. And again, this is game over. Black is up a pawn with a completely winning position. Now, one more trap for black, which I wouldn't really call a trap, but it's interesting for a bullet game. So e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, all of those traps that we looked at so far are reasonable, and the moves played are fine. This trap is not fine. If you try to set it up, you're accepting that you're worse as black, and that's h5. So what you want to do with h5 is give your knight the g4 square. So white should take on e5, and black tries this funny looking knight g4. Now white is completely winning after either d4 or knight f3. +2 or +3. But if white plays pawn to h3, then checkmate. Queen h4 check. G3 only move, otherwise queen f2. Queen g3. King e2, queen f2. And that's gonna be it. If you go king d3, then knight e5 is checkmate because all the squares are covered. Yeah, now I'm gonna be talking about what happens if black does something other than d5, and I'm going to show you some traps that can happen from there. So e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4. I should mention that d6 is a bad move and white should have a slightly better position. Black really should go d5, and I talked about d6 extensively in the introductory video, so again you can watch that. Now let's look at what happens if black takes that pawn. If black takes on f4, black is losing. And here are a couple of examples. So we go e5, the knight has 0 squares. The knight has to go to g8. And after knight g8, we go knight f3. It's very important to cover the h4 square so that the queen cannot deliver this check. Now black's best attempt is d6. Okay, we go d4 or queen e2, but let's say d4. If d5, bishop b5 check. If c6, bishop c4. And now what happens if black just takes everything? So here, castles, takes the knight, well, then black loses the queen, bishop f7, king e7, rook e1 check, and that's it. King f7 only move, and queen takes queen. So you can expect that type of position if black takes the pawn on f4 and then continues on being greedy. Another example, if ef4, e5, well, what if not knight g8, what if queen e7 trying to pin your pawn? Well, you just unpin, and now the knight has to move again. It has 0 squares. So after knight g8, knight f3 again covering this square, d6 again best attempt, and now the queen is in trouble. Knight d5, queen d8, and e takes d6, check. Bishop e6, let's say, is the most sensible, and then knight c7. King d7, knight e5, check, and that's going to be game over. King d6 is the only move. Knight takes e6, f takes e6, knight f7, and you lose the queen. So that could happen. So black should not take the pawn on f4. Another example, what if black doesn't go d6 and doesn't take the pawn on f4? What if black tries to defend with knight c6? Well, this is equally bad, because after f e5, knight e5, we go d4. And now the knights are going to get chased around. If knight g6, then e5, knight g8, knight f3, and white is winning. And even simpler, if knight g4, then just e5, and the knights cannot hold onto each other. Just queen takes g4. So those were some examples of traps you can expect out of the Vienna Gambit. Now, let's go back for a second. So after f4, black's main move is d5, and black should stick to d5. White, I should mention, can take on d5. That's playable, but I don't think it's good. It's a tricky line that gives black a slight edge. I mean, black almost always has a slight edge, but this is more than slight. So for example, if knight d5, then f e5, knight c3, bc3, and queen h4 check. And Hikaru Nakamura played this against Onishchuk in the US Championship. He played king e2, which is just, this is how the game went. Knight f3, knight c6, and then queen e1. This has been played by several players. Hikaru Nakamura played it twice, won one game, drew the other. So it's playable. I should also mention that after knight takes d5, or sorry, instead of knight takes d5, black can also go e takes f4, and white's idea is d4. And after bishop d6, it should be slightly less crazy. So definitely after d5, e d5 is possible, but I wouldn't say it's the best idea. The main move is taking on e5, knight e4. And now, as I said, we're going to be looking at knight f3 and queen f3. One alternative we should mention is pawn to d3, which I don't think is good, because in most cases you want to go d4, and this way you're doing it in two tempi. So knight c3, bc3, and black really should go d4 to prevent d4. But even if black doesn't go d4, white is still okay. Black can go something like bishop e7, and white either continues knight f3 or d4. And as you can see, white spent two tempi to play d4, so I don't think this is as promising. Now, let's start with the main lines. Let's look at queen f3. So we are in this position: e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4, d5, f e5, knight e4, and queen f3. The alternative, again, is going to be knight f3, which we're going to look at in the last part of this video. So queen f3 may seem more aggressive than knight f3. But the first thing I would like you to know is that it actually leads to calmer positions and endgames way more often, because one of the main patterns in queen f3 lines is queen h4 check, and after g3, queen e4 check with a queen trade, which is forced. So this pattern you should remember. If you go queen f3, and if black knows their stuff, they're going to go into an endgame which is roughly level. However, I believe it's slightly more pleasant for white, but that's extremely subjective because the engine gives all zeros. Okay, now, black doesn't have to take on c3, but black's main idea is to take on c3. We're going to look at two alternatives first. f5 is the slightly uncommon move. Now, against f5, you don't want to take this, improving black's position. You go d3, chase the knight away. Takes, and black goes d4. Now, one of the main ideas, if black did not play queen h4 yet, is to go queen g3. That's another pattern you should remember. This does three things: puts pressure on g7, makes it harder to develop the bishop. And even if you do take on g7 and queen h4, you still have queen g3 back. It also defends the pawn, and of course it prevents queen h4. You don't really care about the pawn. If dc3, you just go bishop e2, and something like g6, bishop g5 should be very promising for us. So after queen g3, knight c6 is probably the best idea. we still continue developing the same way. Bishop e6. Bishop f3 is possible, although I think c4 is better. You can play bishop f3 later. If you go bishop f3 now, then you're going to end up playing c4 anyway, and you're going to have to be worried about the c2 pawn. For example, bishop f3, queen d7, c4, knight b4. This is a position you can commonly get, and then you, of course, have to play bishop to d1, h6, for example, h4. And it's a messy position. The engine gives it a slightly better for black. I can understand why. The pawn on e5 is kind of awkwardly placed and the pawn on c2 is weak. And after something like c5 or b5, white's center begins to crumble. And if black castles queenside instead of expanding on the queen side, then g5 can be fairly tricky. So f5 is not something to overlook, but it's not too dangerous. It should be about equal. Another alternative is knight c6. And after knight c6, there's this pattern with knight d4, which is usually combined with bishop g4 if we go knight f3, but if there's a queen on f3 instead of knight f3, then knight d4 in itself is a threat. So, because it of course forks 2 points. So to prevent that, we always react to knight c6 in queen f3 lines with bishop b5. Okay, now black should really take on c3. And we can take with the b pawn, or with the c pawn, or with the d pawn. I should say that taking with the b pawn is never good in these lines, in my opinion, because of the endgame I talked about. So if you take with the b pawn, then queen h4 check, queen f2, and queen f2, king f2, and bishop d7, for example. And I think, I mean, I'm not convinced. Or if you go g3, the pattern I talked about, then queen e4 takes. It should be a more pleasant endgame for black. I mean, black has 0 structural damage unless you give up the bishop pair. And if you do give up the bishop pair, this is just dreadful. Because with the bishop pair and these central weaknesses, black is just going to have an easier position to play. So I think that taking with the d pawn is more principled. And now, of course, queen h4 again. And same thing, we go g3, but now after queen e4 takes, we take on c6. We've given up the bishop pair, but we can easily castle queenside, and our structure compensates for the weaknesses. For example, we can go bishop e3 or knight e2. The engine prefers knight e2, but I like bishop e3 slightly better because it prevents bishop c5. Or knight e2. Black goes bishop c5. So now, for example, rook b8 castles queenside. We don't have the bishop pair, but we do have some nice squares for the knight. For example, the f2 square. If we go knight h3, knight f2, and it's not that easy to defend the pawn, we can also consider knight e2 and jumping into one of these 2 squares. Putting the pawn on a dark square on c5 would create an additional target. Also, very promisingly, we could put the knight on e3, like this, for example. And if our knight blockades that e-pawn, that seems fairly useful to me. So this type of endgame, I think, is good for white. Again, if you turn on the engine, it's going to say minus 0.1, so dead equal. Okay, now knight c6 and f5 were the alternatives. You're not going to be facing that as often. I think the main move by far is going to be knight takes. And now again, dc or bc. BC is actually okay in this position, more so than in other lines, because on queen h4 check here, you can go g3, and on queen e4 takes, you can actually go bishop g2. Your bishop isn't on b5, so this additional tempo is fine to get the bishop to the correct diagonal, because it's not easy to defend the pawn. Okay, so if you play lines without bishop b5, taking with the b pawn is better. So after bc, black doesn't go for queen h4, black should go c5. And now we can go bishop b5 check, and after black defends that somehow. Again, this is the trap I was showing you. If d4, we have the trap. If d4, then cd, cd, queen h4. We looked at this. So bishop b5 check, knight c6, and now again, preventing queen h4, preventing the bishop from developing and defending the pawn. Queen g3, same pattern. Remember this pattern in all queen f3 lines. Bishop e6, knight f3, something like queen b6, a4, a6, we take on c6, that's fine. And again, this I feel is okay for white. The engine gives it as slightly better for white actually. After castles, it's plus 0.2, plus 0.3, which is rare in the Vienna. And we have the F file to work with. We're looking forward to playing the move a5 if allowed at an opportune moment. Maybe d4 is playable once c2 has been defended. So it's a fairly pleasant position. Now dc3 is again slightly better in my opinion, because you want to keep the position in the spirit of the Vienna. And if you play the Vienna, you want to play a sharp opening. So after something like bishop e6, bishop f4, c6, castles queenside, this is what I think people are attempting to get with the Vienna Gambit, and this is something I would consider promising for white. These moves aren't forced, of course, and this you cannot really consider theory because there were a couple of games played, but both sides have chances, and it's not really clear to me where black is going to castle. If black castles kingside, then you have a very natural attacking position with maybe h4, knight h3, knight g5. So if, for example, bishop e7, h4, and then we go knight h3. If castles, then knight h3. You're not afraid of losing this pawn, of course, and it's just very, very, very pleasant. So that's queen f3. Now let's switch to knight f3. Knight f3 is the alternative. So we get this position, and instead of queen f3, we go knight f3. Now, we did a couple of things. The first thing, we got rid of queen h4 checks. That's a very important pattern. We're defending c2, that's also important. So any knight d4 stuff doesn't really work because the queen defends. And let's start with the alternatives. Knight c6 or bishop c5. The main move is bishop e7, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. If bishop c5, we looked at the trap with knight f2, and I mentioned that there's an alternative to d4. You can go queen e2, and now, of course, knight f2 doesn't work. But bishop f2, I think, is very, very promising for black. So this is the only move. And now knight c3, dc3, and bishop b6. The bishop was attacked. And we're going to have to castle by hand. So we go bishop g5, f6 of course isn't playable, queen d7, king d2, h6, bishop h4, castles. And now probably either rook e1 or rook d1. I prefer rook e1, and maybe queen a4. And a3, if you're forced to play something like this, then this is a weakness. And eventually, once you get your king to c1 or b1, then these moves are going to come with additional targets. You're not going to be able to prevent the opening of the queen side. So I believe this is just better for black. The engine gives it as -1. It's not that black is perfectly safe, but white's position is still awkward. If we had a queen on d3, for example, or on g3, and the bishop on d3, and the h-rook on f1, then sure. But it takes time to do that. So I believe that against bishop c5, d4 is a way more promising continuation. However, it does come with a downside, bishop b4, and now you're forced on the defensive. Have to defend c3, and black starts breaking the center. And there are some extremely tricky lines here. Probably the best move is a3, and we get a position like this. Okay, where white still has the bishop pair for the moment. It should be about -0.8 for black, but I think it's easier to play than what I'm about to show you. The engine line after c5, which should give white something very close to equality, is bishop b5 check. And I'm drinking the coffee with hazelnut flavor again. I really don't like it, but I'm out of normal coffee. Too much hazelnut. Nocciole. Sorry, that's hazelnut in Italian. So knight c6, blocking the check. Knight takes e4, d takes e4, and now the tricks begin. We don't move the knight, we go c3. And once again, this is an engine line, so learning this would be absurd, I believe, unless you want to spend 5 hours looking at all the alternatives your opponent could play, which aren't perfect engine lines, and learning how to beat them. Okay, ef3, Queen f3, and now bishop a5. Black saves the bishop. We go d5. We're going to win the piece back by taking the knight on c6. Queen b6 attacks our bishop. We have to defend. a6. And now we're going to lose our bishop, because if we take on c6, we're just a piece down. So the only way to play is queen g3. Black has to go g6, otherwise black is busted after bishop h6. So g6, and now we go e6. And this, according to the engine, is a draw. After a takes b5, e takes f7 check, king takes f7, castles kingside, bishop f5, dc6, we take one of the pieces back, queen c6, and now a b5. And then rook f5. So, and this should be a perpetual check, or if black isn't careful, black gets mated. So if you want to learn these 21 moves, sure, go ahead. That's an alternative you can go for after bishop c5. After bishop c5, d4, bishop b4, bishop d2, c5. If you want that crazy engine line, bishop b5. If you want to play the human way, play a3, which is worse for white according to the engine, but I think easier to play. All right, now the second alternative to the main line is knight c6, and this isn't as tricky. We can just go bishop to b5 again. And now, of course, there's a transposition in this position. You can go bishop c5 as black, and we're kind of in a similar position without c5, where these two pieces are looking at our king. The difference is that now if we go d4, maybe after bishop b6, we're going to be forced to give up our bishop pair, but I still think d4 is okay. So I wouldn't call that troublesome. But bishop e7 is better for black. You don't have to allow d4. And now you can go castles kingside, or you can go queen e2, threatening to take the knight, so forcing knight c3, dc3, castles, and bishop f4. I think this is fairly pleasant. I wouldn't call knight c6 on move 5 tricky, because we're just going to castle queenside, and there isn't going to be any trouble at all after f6 castles queenside. Our position looks good. Again, slightly better for black according to the engine, but double-edged, and white is playing for a win just as much as black. Okay, but in most cases, black's going to go bishop e7. That's the safest move, that's the best move. Now we can go d4 or queen e2 as white. We can also go d3 or play something weird like bishop e2. But I think queen e2 is the best move, simply forcing the issue on e4. So we go queen e2, knight c3. In this position, taking with the d pawn is actually better. If you take with the b pawn, you're ruining your structure for no reason, and you're a tempo down in opening this bishop up. I mean, there's no reason to do this. If you go queen e2, you probably want to castle queenside, so it makes very little sense to take with the b pawn. So d takes, preparing to develop the bishop and castle queenside. c5 makes sense. Bishop f4 makes sense again. Very standard moves, and castles queenside. And we got the same position we had with 5 knight c6, but the pawn is on c5, which is an accomplishment for black, but it's not really a big deal. I mean, d4 is very hard to play. It helps you play b5, b4, but again, that too isn't too problematic. Let's say bishop e6, h4, we can start attacking. If h6, then g3, we want to consolidate our position and maybe play bishop h3 if allowed, because our bishop is bad. So queen d7 preventing that. So bishop g2. And now with black castles kingside, we may even have stuff like knight g5. So if, for example, this, I mean, I don't know. If bishop g4 should be the only move, but we have bishop f3 followed by queen h2. Or if takes, we have queen takes and queen h5. So after bishop g2, I think black should really castle queenside. And now this structure is similar to what black plays against the Caro-Kann in the bishop f5 main lines. And I've always found this easier to play for black. For example, we can just go h5, taking a bit more space. Not that this is the Caro-Kann, but it's just similar where white has pawns on d4 and c4 against the main lines. So in conclusion, the Vienna Gambit, if both sides know what they're doing, isn't really a sharp opening. It will lead to positions that are slightly better for black, but not tricky at all, especially if you go queen f3. And you can expect positional games, actually. Okay, I'm going to continue this series with the last video, black playing knight c6 on move 2. And we're going to do that tomorrow. Thank you very much, guys, for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.